Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. Christopher Banham joins this episode to discuss with us about navigating burnout, starting a tutoring business, and the impact of autism stories on his life over the last year. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Christopher, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be here with you on this, what is one of my favorite podcasts.
Thank you so much for that. And I'd love to start off our discussion with learning about where does your story in the autism community begin?
Well, I think like a lot of late diagnosed people, it begins a lot earlier than we know it's begun. It begins with that sort of sense in our childhood or youth that in some way there's a difference between perhaps us and the people around us, and yet we can't quite discern what that might be. And that was always the case for me. In terms of a realization that I was autistic, it was later than that. And I know, pretty much exactly where it was. When I became a teacher, we had training like all teachers do on a variety of different ways in which we can best cater for our students. And we had a glut of these when the school I was employed in at the time changed its status and started taking in a wider variety of students than it had done previously. And we had some training relating to autism. And there weren't many of us in this little room, only those of us who were due to be working with this, our first autistic student. And as we had this training led by an external provider, I was sat there, thinking, hang on a minute, this is me, isn't it? And it was an interesting realization because I'd done training relating to autism before, but like a lot of that training, it was quite generic. It wasn't enough for me to look at myself and say that's me, whereas this was the first time when I could do that because it was better training. I didn't do anything particularly about it at that time because, I didn't feel the need to accept to look at that with curiosity and perhaps use it to inform some aspects of the way I was looking at and developing my life and my career. Other than for that, it didn't really shape my life very much at all. It wasn't until the late 2010s, I think it was 2017, 2018, when I sought a diagnosis myself. The principal reason I did that was because by this time I had two children, and I wanted to seek that diagnosis in the sense that if we had to go down that path for either of my children, it might expedite that process. It might help to inform that process in terms of what that might look like and how it might work. And also, an element of self-discovery there, an element of kind of making something which I knew official, not, I don't need to hang a tag on it, hang a label on it, but as part of your own self-development, I felt it was kind of the next step in that journey. But still, even by that point, and heading into COVID, was I part of an autistic community, either face to face or online? No, I didn't. I wasn't. I didn't feel as though I was, and I wasn't open with my diagnosis with anyone except my wife, actually, and my GP. Nobody else. There was no. I didn't feel as though there was any great need to. So it's only lately that I've become part of an autistic community, really, in any formal or any really significant sense, I think.
Now, from what I understand, you've had two massive burnouts in the last couple of years. So, looking back, what were some of the things you would caution other autistic people to look for in order for at times when they're going through burnout for it not to get to such an intense level?
Yeah, that's right. Two burnouts, or, probably more realistically, one burnout with two distinct phases. I mentioned previously that, I was a classroom teacher and I began my teaching career. It's 21 years now I've been teaching. Started off in higher education when I was working on my PhD here in Leeds in the United Kingdom. I taught in that sector for some time before training to go and teach in secondary schools, which I've taught for many years now. And then very rapidly I moved up as a departmental leader and then a senior leader. My career and my life in all respects was going very swimmingly until it wasn't. The symptoms started to creep up. The first I really noticed was a shaking. I felt fine otherwise. I thought I did, but I was shaking. And then over time, the symptoms got worse and more. I'll just give you a little summary of what those symptoms were. There was anxiety, felt in sort of body and in mind. There was agoraphobia. There was a great increased sensory intolerance. Situational mutism, aphasia and other speech issues. There was chronic fatigue, dissociation, memory loss, brain fog, de-skilling, loss of executive function. Burnout doesn't show up in all these ways for everybody. Some people get all of those things, some people get different things and more. And they can develop in a different order and with different severity as well. The point being for me, I think, and the point I think it's important to share with other people is that that autistic burnout is a thing, because at the start of this, I didn't know anything about it. The first I knew about it was when it happened, and when for the first time I realized that after a few days of calling in to work sick, I realized, there's a real problem here. I can't go in, there's a problem. And I'd been off for, I was signed off sick at this point, maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And I was Googling everything. I was trying to find out what was going on. And eventually I struck on this thing, autistic burnout. Eureka, that's it. If you're autistic and your body and cognition are falling apart, this may be what it is. So please, it's a plea from me to be able to recognize earlier than I did and I could when this is happening. In response more directly to the question you asked, how might people know, perhaps in more advanced than I might have been able to spot this? Well, if you're someone who's prone to overwork, perhaps this might be something which happens to you. If you've been living a life where, as much as you might enjoy work and thrive in work and become strong in work, if you're living a time when your life is work, your time and attention is given over only to work and a brief window of rest or sleep in between, you might find yourself in burnout if you're not giving over time to, what we in the autistic community call sometimes special interests, or if you're not working in a monotropic way, which perhaps in ordinary circumstances you might thrive in. You might be heading into burnout before you know it. That's certainly what I was doing. I was working long hours for many years in a manner in which perhaps wasn't suited to my natural way of working. And that was fine. That was great. I loved it and I thrived in it until I didn't. And when I didn't, it was too late. Relating to this, I suppose, is the idea of living inauthentically. I worked and I succeeded and I excelled, but it wasn't I wasn't operating optimally. I was working in an environment which was full of people and loud and frenetic and doing many different things all at once and in a sequence. Whereas my preferred optimal way of working is in a quiet place with just me, focusing on one thing. I did very well working out of my comfort zone until I didn't, at which point it was too late. Some of the things which had allowed me to really succeed in work were actually things I lacked: a lack of introception and that classic autistic trope, alexithymia. This sort of lack of awareness of what's going on in your body, what's going on in your mind. In some ways, that can be a real strength in the workplace, because it means that when other people, their bodies and their cognition is saying, fear, fear, run away, this is difficult, I wasn't. My body and mind weren't telling me that. And so I was thriving in difficult situations which perhaps other people weren't able to, until I wasn't, until it all caught up with me in one great big debt that the universe came to claim back from me. Something which had once been a great ally of mine turned out to be a great fallibility, when all of a sudden something which had been a mainstay of my arsenal totally disappeared. The other thing to watch out for, if you're to think about, if you're an autistic person perhaps heading into burnout, is, are you working in a toxic environment? I was very fortunate that the schools and other establishments I worked in, I chose specifically because I had a real affinity with them and really enjoyed working in them and working with the people who I worked with and working on the things I worked doing. But unfortunately, the educational sector over here in the UK is a very difficult sector to work in right now. We're having great difficulties in all manner of things that we're doing. That's been the case for a while, and it looks that that'll be the case for a while yet, although, we are talking about ways in which these things can be improved. Teachers, never mind autistic teachers, but just teachers, we're all on what sometimes we call meerkat mode. We're all hyper vigilant, we're all hyper alert. And there's only so much as a human, and certainly as an autistic human, you can sustain that until your body and your cognition tell you that's too much of that to keep going. And those facilities which have helped you to thrive again start to shut down. And that's what I was getting: shut down in the school environment, shut down in the classroom. And it's difficult to teach in normal circumstances, let alone when you're in the middle of shutdown. So there's quite a few things to look out there for. There's one more thing, though, that I think is really important, and one of your recent episodes focused on this, and I think we're only at the beginning of this story, and that's long COVID. Long COVID, I think, for me, is what tipped the balance between thriving on the edge and being exhausted and being frayed, but using those as a springboard to success in my own life and in helping other people's, young people's lives. Long COVID is the difference, I think, between doing that on the edge and going too far over that edge and not being able to thrive in that environment anymore, because those things which had allowed me to operate in that, within those margins, had now gone. Only time will tell how that'll work out for me, how that'll work out for autistic people, how that'll work out for everybody. But I know for me in the short term, that's changed those margins for me to mean I can't work in that environment right now. So there's a lot of things to look out for, but I'm hoping that, as more people talk about this, it'll mean that more people are aware, and perhaps more people won't get to the stage that I got to, where, really it's damage, limitation, and recovery that's your agenda, rather than avoiding burnout.
Now, I understand that podcasts and you mentioned with Autism Stories being one of them that you regularly listen to, have been helpful in your recovery from burnout. So, like, in what ways has Autism Stories been helpful in this recovery process?
That's right. I mentioned a moment ago that when I first became ill, I didn't know what was happening. So I I spent a number of weeks just Googling everything, Googling every aspect of my identity and Googling every symptom in every combination. Before I was a teacher, I was a researcher, and I was used to digging out things to try and find answers. So this is really sort of natural territory for me. And I stumbled, I was aware of burnout, but I didn't really know about what burnout actually was, let alone autistic burnout, which, is an overlapping but a distinct thing. When I found it, a few little articles here and there, it was a real eureka moment. That's it. And I knew. And from that point on, I knew which route I had to take. And that's find everything that I possibly could about what was going on. Problem is, there wasn't much out there. So there were a few academic articles, really we're talking about the infancy of this field in terms of academic studies. A few bits and pieces on the internet, people who've written about their own experiences, a very few things on social media. I mean, things of substance which you can really glean roots out of autistic burnout. Podcasts. Podcasts was one of the main things because increasingly there were people talking on podcasts about this type of thing in the autistic community. I think this is arising out of just naturally people experiencing this more coming out of COVID, people talking about it more coming out of COVID, and the facilities with which to do this coming out of COVID. That natural convergence is just leading right now to a real expansion in discussion about this. We're not talking an overabundance of this, but it was enough to allow me to learn about what was going on and how to get out of it. Autism Stories in particular was really useful because a lot of the time they're short, so they're easily digestible to the burned out individual. You're getting regular people talking on there, people like myself, just people who are leading normal lives, but very often they've had experiences of transition, if not through burnout, then certainly through transition, perhaps because of some aspect of, maybe they had some trauma or there's been some gaslighting or some other type of social rejection or whatever, something they have overcome, or rags to riches or whatever it might be, something which allows you to look at that and say, right, here's the toolkit they have used to remove themselves from that situation and become part of this situation. Let's see what I can glean from this, if not necessarily from like a pathway in terms of a to-do list, a pathway in terms of inspiration, a motivation, where you can learn from their spirit, if not the exact steps of their journey. That's where particularly Autism Stories really came in handy. Another thing which was really handy about Autism Stories is the regularity of the show. It's a strange one about, really I was very, very ill for about 6 months, particularly from February to about August 2023. That was the worst spell when I'd been back to school and I'd burned out again, but this time much more severely in terms of the recovery. I was really struggling in many, many respects. And after a time, because I found it so difficult to go out and because I was finding such difficulty in speaking with anybody else, for the first time in, really 2 decades, I felt a little bit lonely. I wasn't used to this at all. I'd never felt lonely for, like I say, nearly 20 years, because if anything, I had too much company. And so it was nice to have that regularity, that I knew what podcasts were going to drop on what days. I could expect to hear those familiar voices and feel those familiar sensations on my familiar walks. And that's a great comfort when you're an autistic person, as many of your listeners will know, to take comfort in that familiarity and to get strength from that familiarity to take you to a place where once again you can start to deal with some of the more difficult things which you might have to face in life. So my thanks to anyone who's done a podcast on Autism Stories over the last 12 months, and to yourself, Doug, for your input on your company during that time. And, it goes to show to anyone who's, doing a podcast like this, there's, even if people aren't in contact, there's people listening and people getting real value from what you do, which is what motivated me to get in touch with yourself, Doug, and say, well, look, I'd love to contribute in the hope there's other people who can get value from what I'm saying, which is if you are burned out or you're at risk of burning out, take care of yourself. And if you're already burned out, here's perhaps a route out of it.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite things about the podcast is more and more people have reached out that are listeners that want to share their stories. So I love that. You've already talked about your teaching background. And recently, you've started a tutoring business as you've worked in education for over 20 years. What have you learned in that time are some things that teachers and tutors can do to better support autistic students?
That's right. I'm not leaving education. I'm leaving schools for now. It may not be forever, but it's certainly for now. Speaking with people in the autistic community, I've always asked people the question, have you ever known anyone to totally burn out and to go back into the environment they burned out in, where it's unlikely that they'll be able to change because of the culture of that environment? No one's ever said yes. I'm not saying it's not possible, but no one's ever said yes. And I know that if I go back into that environment, how long would I last? A day, a week, a month? I don't know. That's the case now. It may not be the case in a year, 2 years, 5, but it's the case now. So I know that it's not right for me right now. But I also know that I'm still an educator and I don't want to leave that environment. I know about the way in which I've worked with young people for 21 plus years now. I know about the value I've got from them. I know about the value they have got from me. So it was a question of, well, what am I going to do with this? Again, a convergence of things happening because COVID has opened the world up. It's meant that, yes, there's people who are now finding it difficult for one reason or another to work in the jobs they're used to. But it also means that people are becoming more used to the idea of being online and learning online and supporting people learning online. The world is changing in this respect. There's an increasing number of people tutoring online. It's still fractional compared with people tutoring in institutions, schools and colleges and universities and what have you. But for a number of people, they're looking at this and going, that's going to suit where I am now. I'm going to be able to bring more value to young people or adults through that format, and also it will improve my life and my work as well. Now, until lately, I loved every aspect of teaching in schools, even the difficult bits, because I thrived on the difficult bits and I love supporting students and adults through those difficult bits. But it became apparent that that was no longer a good option for me. So, taking a step back, I thought, well, if not now, when? If I can't go and do something off on a tangent, pivot as the modern parlance has it, then if not now, then when? In terms of supporting people in schools now, it's using all of my skill set, which I've learned across all of that time, to support all of the people I've worked with through quality teaching. I'll just be transferring that into a tuition context at home. In terms of things I've learned specifically about what teachers and tutors can do to better support autistic students, whether that be in a school or online or wherever, I always start off with just one word, and that's listen. Listen. Or to broaden that out, just be attentive to what the individuals or autistic people you're working with are saying or doing, or because if you're not doing that, you can have all the checklists in the world, all the training in the world. If you're not being attentive and responsive to what you see in front of you, then it's not worth a whole heck of a lot. Listen to those neurodivergent people within your own context and create a culture and an environment in your teaching in the classroom or online where it's okay for people to say openly what they need to say about their needs. Because sometimes autistic people, like I did for all those years, said I was fine and said I didn't need anything. Whereas in actual fact, it was just that was what I was doing to get by through the day. In the longer term, it's much more profitable to form that genuine environment where people are being listened to and what they're saying is the truth, and the truth which is going to bring good for all parties in that educational equation. The other thing I might add is invest in quality training. I've experienced training of great quality in terms of autistic provision in educational contexts over the years, and I've experienced, less good, still valuable and still done with heart and meaning and good intentions, but perhaps too generic, perhaps focusing on those things which now in our autistic world are becoming things we're trying to say, well, that's all interesting and perhaps useful general information, but you really need to have dialogue with individuals, autistic individuals, to really know how you need to operate in a day-to-day manner. And that's what I'll be doing. Hopefully in my business, I'll be working with autistic people, I'll be working with non-autistic people, I'll be working with people of all kinds, as I always have throughout my career. And regardless of who a person is, my main way of supporting that person is to ask them how I can support them and to listen to what they say. And it's never gone wrong yet. and I'm sure going forward, it's going to be a profitable tactic as well.
Your tutoring is going to focus on history, geography, and religious studies. So, why the focus on these three subjects in particular?
It's because I find them interesting. Gosh, it must be a real struggle to teach something that you don't have any interest in. But sometimes people do. I think sometimes that can show, though. But, I do these things because I'm interested in these things, and I'm interested in helping other people understand them and learn about them. And I've always been, all the way through my career, as much as a learner as a teacher. It's always been great for me to work within those subjects and to keep learning and to keep teaching and to keep getting stronger and to keep helping other people to get stronger too. I think in our world there's an increased tendency for specialization, and the idea that specialization is the only way to go and the only way in which to thrive within study, within work, within academia, within whatever. But this never used to be the way, until recently. It used to be that people who were in pursuit of knowledge tended to do that through a variety of disciplines. And of course, there was a time when the idea of having separate disciplines wasn't an idea at all. It can be really useful and profitable to specialize, but it can also be really useful and profitable to look at different things. And that's what I do. I specialize in humanities, but within humanities, I find it profitable to look at those three subjects and more. The reason being that when you understand the complementarity between those subjects, all of them become stronger for your knowledge and for your enjoyment and for your ability to teach those things, for children, students' knowledge and their enjoyment. If I didn't know as much about history, I'd be a worse teacher of religious studies, and vice versa. I've always found this to be really, really mutually reinforcing, and that's why I've not left any of them behind in my new business now. There are other things I could have added into the mix, but I didn't want to cloud it too much. I thought the three major subjects which students in the United Kingdom study in schools would be my focus, and then in the future, who knows. So it's what I did as a teacher and what I'll continue to do in my tuition in the future as well. Three subjects within the one specialism.
And how can our listeners learn about your tutoring beyond this interview?
Okay. Well, yes, I am. I am leaving the classroom. The official launch of my tutoring business, which is called Dr. Humanities, is on the 1st of January. My Instagram and my Facebook are up and running and have been since November. You can see those on both Instagram and Facebook at Dr. Humanities. You'll know it's me by the logo, which is 3 columns, 3 different colors: blue, green, red, for the 3 different subjects. That's the logo representing Dr. Humanities, and the website is also coming soon, sometime in January 2024. So I'd love to hear from people on my social media. I'd really enjoy hearing from you all.
Now, moving away from tutoring, something that you've done that I must know more about is that you've edited a new version of The Skeleton Crew or Wildfire Ned that was first published, I believe, in the 1860s about Edward Warbeck and his quest to defeat murderous bandits known as the Skeleton Crew. So, what the heck initially drew you to an interest in skeleton pirates?
That's right. This all goes back to when I was an undergraduate here in Leeds, and I wrote my dissertation, or as you call it in America, my thesis, on the periodical literature, the magazines of Victorian boys, Victorian youth. And I started off looking at the magazines which were read by sort of middle class or well-to-do youth. They're things about improving your life, perhaps through very sort of fortifying stories and true life articles about hobbies which would make you manly and strong. And this is a route I pursued for a while in my studies. When I went on to do my PhD, though, in the same field, also at Leeds, I became more interested in the underbelly of this world, where there was a thriving industry of publication of similar periodicals, similar magazines for working class young people. And it turns out that this industry was publishing hundreds of periodicals every year, read by hundreds of thousands of young working class and lower middle class boys, sold for just a penny per copy in weekly parts. You know, this was a time, of course, before TV, before radio, before the internet. You know, this was having your finger on the pulse for these young people of current culture. So it would have been very exciting to pick up off the magazine rack the latest installment of whatever magazine was your favorite. The Skeleton Crew was one of a glut of periodicals we refer to as penny dreadfuls. Weekly parts, a penny a part, lurid illustrations, thrilling, sensational fiction. And I read this stuff and I was hooked. I thought it was great. So this is what I wrote my thesis on: 100,000 words on this type of literature. And eventually it led me to publish an edited volume of a work I particularly liked, which was the Skeleton Crew. The Skeleton Crew, yes, was a story written in the 1860s featuring the hero, whose name was Edward Warbeck, and the murderous skeleton bandits who pursued him, and did a very good job of it. And he did a very good job of chopping them down over many weekly parts. We chose, myself and my colleague Elizabeth Stearns, we chose the Skeleton Crew because we really liked the story, we really liked the words, we really liked the illustrations, but we also really liked the accompanying material which came along with the story. A number of people wrote about the Skeleton Crew. At the time, there were critics writing about how they thought it was an awful story leading children astray. There were critics writing about how they loved the story, thought it was really exciting and thrilling literature. It was also staged. A play was made, believe it or not, on the Britannia Theatre in London of the Skeleton Crew. And amazingly, we still have the script from this play, where young people again would have paid a penny to cram themselves into the stalls and to see this thrilling play on the stage. So we decided we'd put together a package, the full text edited down with footnotes, an introduction, all these critical essays, and the transcribed play in one volume for the modern reader. It was what is known as a labor of love, putting this type of thing together. You're never going to get rich, but we don't do these things for that purpose. And it was real fun as an autistic person, a real immersive experience. The deep dive into the literature and the culture of the literature and the mechanics of putting it together as a volume was, seventh heaven for someone whose brain operates like me. So that was where it came from, and that was really where it ended, because at that point I got very busy in my career, and the Skeleton Pirates have really taken a back seat, with the career and the family in the driver's seat and the passenger side.
I understand. Well, earlier you were talking about the spirit of some of our previous guests here on Autism Stories. And I wanted to thank you for bringing your spirit to today's episode and sharing that with me and our listeners and our community. So thanks so much. It was great to get to know you a little bit today, Christopher.
Oh, well, thank you ever so much for having me on, and thank you for providing us with such a great podcast and consistently great guests every time.
We always love hearing from you, and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on how you've coped with autistic burnout. Thanks so much to Christopher for the conversation. To learn more about Christopher and his tutoring business, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Here at Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for our autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what has worked for them and about the things that they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients and then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you want a guide in your life to coach you to help you get the things you desire? If so, then visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.